Freedmen's Bureau was starting up, and certainly Congress had some measures that they were starting to come up with vis-a-vis Lincoln as well. How did Lincoln interact with Congress at the end?
Do we have a couple of more hours?
No.
No. You know,
They're going to have to read the book.
a lot has yes, okay. A lot has been made about Lincoln and his, the Republicans in Congress, and Chris, you could probably speak a little bit about this. Were they at loggerheads? Was there more conflict, particularly with the radicals against Spielberg, with Stevens and Lincoln? Projecting a little bit, and I do this a little bit in the book. They would have figured something out. Lincoln and the Republicans in Congress would have come up with a program, and I don't think it's difficult at all to envision a Lincoln pretty quickly agreeing to equality before the law, legal equality, and black suffrage, full black suffrage. Where Lincoln would have run into a problem is trying to reconstruct Southern plantation society, right? Because that's how are you going to get over those insurmountable problems? We know from the historical record that those problems were probably insurmountable, and I don't think Lincoln would have figured it out. So where you reach the limits of Lincoln's thinking, as it were, on Reconstruction, is not race. It's not what we know as civil rights. Lincoln, I think, would have pretty quickly come to what we know as civil rights. But on political economy, social and economic relations, how do you remake the plantation society? Because Lincoln's thinking was so firmly grounded in the free labor ideology. I don't see how he would have been able to figure that out.
Would some of the Southern plantation owners just go along with whatever emancipation is because they felt that they could control afterwards anyway?
Yes, but there were certainly some who were thinking that. But overwhelmingly, the white South was utterly opposed to any kind of what we would recognize as racial equality. And so what happens when you run into that? What would Lincoln have done when he runs into that massive resistance?
That's what I wonder about, thinking about the Tea Party today, and the problems we have in politics is like this, and we're not getting anywhere. I wonder if they could have gotten anywhere, or if one side would have just bluffed its way through, and that would have been it. We don't know.
Well, in 1861, they couldn't figure it out,
Yeah,
and so
they
they
went to
basically
war.
had to go to war.
That's right.
And now that the war is over,
I think we
and
could
what is
have
the
that
war?
today sometimes.
What is the meaning of the Union? And now that slavery has been abolished, now what is it? We don't know. Again, we don't know because Lincoln is removed.
Let's go back to some of the antecedents here, back in 48. What were his real achievements as a congressman? He was there for 2 years, for heaven's sakes. But you're saying, of course, in here, those were 2 important years. And so what were some of the achievements that he did? So he certainly was trying to get slavery out of the District of Columbia. That had gradual emancipation and had compensation for slave owners. But he probably would have had to repudiate the popular sovereignty part of that later on. Well, what were his achievements during the time?
Sure, the consensus had always been, and I've been surprised at how often I've found this, that Abraham Lincoln was not a successful congressman. And it just didn't, it was discordant. How does this person who starts with nothing in life, maybe the lowest station in life of anyone who's ever risen to the highest in this country, he's great at everything, but he's not a good congressman? And so I guess I was not surprised to come away from this experience feeling that, in fact, he was a very successful congressman. I mean, we do have to remember he only had 2 years. And the D.C. Emancipation Bill that you talk about, I thought was fascinating because he actually works on it with Joshua Giddings, the great abolitionist, but then he also goes to people who have a completely divergent viewpoint and works with them and tries to craft a compromise bill, something that can actually get done. And of course, sometimes those compromise bills get crushed by both sides, but at least he was trying to work on the issue. So one of the things I was surprised to find is that Lincoln was actually a very good legislator. I think his signal accomplishment, and he shares this with other people, is the omnibus postal bill. So there's now we deliver mail to the Grand Canyon, but in America in 1848, we delivered mail to a very limited number of areas, and so that determined where people could live, where they could do business. The omnibus postal bill every year that came out of every Congress was a very big deal. And so I've held this bill in my hands. His handwriting is all over it. And it gets sent back to committee at one point. It runs into a huge logjam, as you can imagine. Anything with that many, potential vested interests involved, everyone's got to get their share. But Lincoln's going around to people from other states and saying, what is it going to take to get this bill done? Mm-hmm. And so it gets sent back to the Post Offices and Post Roads Committee, of which Lincoln is a member, and it comes back out to the floor under a different number. It ends up getting signed by the president. And so the fact that he actually had a mastery of the, it might not be the sexiest thing in the world. It certainly doesn't excite 21st century historians, as I've seen in their books about this, but it was important for the people that it impacted. It was important for his constituents.
Orville Burton, in his book on Lincoln here in Illinois, stresses how Illinois probably gave him that ability, because on circuit, political, legal, he had to come across every political stripe there was. He lived in central Illinois, which is really a border state.
Yeah.
And he had to learn how to deal with everyone, and he seemed to have gone right into Congress and done that. Yeah. What committees was he on?
So he's on Post Offices and Post Roads, and then he's on something called Expenditures and the War Department, which actually sounds like a really important committee, but from what I can tell, they barely ever met. There was a committee for every executive department, and they were there to sort of scrutinize what was happening in the executive departments. But there's one scene I remember in the book, I saw this in the House, the Congressional Globe, where somebody's fighting like heck to stop their bill from getting sent to one of those committees, because he says those committees they never meet. This committee hasn't met in 2 years. And so my sense is that Post Offices and Post Roads is what we would call an A committee today in Congress. It's financial services, it's energy and commerce, it's ways and means.
As a Whig, he would have been very interested in this.
Right, and as someone who came from, who was a postmaster, a small-town postmaster, which is probably why he got his assignment there. And so a incredible detail to the process of making legislation. Also, he was a leader because of his political skill. He was, like I said, he was one of the first 7 people behind Zachary Taylor, and he plays a really important role in Taylor's presidential campaign. He actually is the one left at headquarters, sort of to be in charge, while Taylor's campaign manager is on a campaign swing. And of course, he gives a campaign swing throughout Massachusetts and some other eastern states.
You call him a kingmaker.
Yeah,
presidential maker.
Yeah, presidential maker. He's part of a group of people certainly who are responsible for that.
How many speeches did he give in Congress, and how do you evaluate them?
So he gives a speech on the spot resolutions, right? Which nearly ends his political career. The Mexican-American War was a very popular war in Illinois. Illinois met its quota probably faster than any other state for volunteers for the Mexican-American War. In fact, shortly before Lincoln went to Congress, Illinois was having a convention to redraw their constitution. And when the preacher said something that sounded suspiciously opposed to the war, he nearly got physically assaulted. So if we're willing to do that to a priest or a preacher, imagine what they'd do to a congressman who dared to go out and speak against the war. And then also, John Hardin, his predecessor, dies at the Battle of Buena Vista. And so, look, we've got this unworthy successor to Hardin in his chair, condemning the war that he died in. So it's a very bold move on his part. And it usually is regarded today as something that went over with a thud. But as I point out in the book, and I wasn't the one who found this, even Riddle talks about this in the 1940s, people are trying to refute his speech months later. So it was something that clearly left an impression on people. This did not go over with a thud.
This is a well-known speech. What others did he give?
He gives a speech on internal improvements. So part of his, the Whig philosophy is this American system. We're going to have bridges, roads, tunnels, harbors. We're going to have a credit system in the country, really anticipating the modern economy and using infrastructure to try to create a truly national market and to try to diversify the economy.
Did he learn things from the River and Harbor Convention when he came up to Chicago for the first time and this translated here?
Oh, I think quite a bit. And, it was something he could see when he ran for the legislature for the first time. He talks about widening the Sangamon River, in order to improve commerce in his part of the world. So I think he always sort of innately understood. And he grew up near the Cumberland Road in Kentucky, so he saw what public works could do to sort of diversify the economy, create economic growth.
Did others later remember besides the spotty, but the other speeches that he gave and how he presented himself?
Well, it's probably best to say that there were 4 speeches, and it's funny because everyone seems to remember 3, and my guess is they're not the same 3. That some remembered one, some remembered here. So he gives the spot resolution speech, the internal improvement speech. He gives a long and very well-received speech on the House floor condemning the Democratic nominee, Lewis Cass, and supporting Zachary Taylor's bid for the presidency, had the House in stitches, and at one point the Democrats just threw up their hands and surrendered because he had verbally beaten them down so badly.
I want to go back quickly to something you had mentioned about his opposition in a state here that was pro-war.
Yeah.
How did he get to that, and how did he survive it? But how did he go to oppose the Mexican War in the midst of all his other Whigs, many of them going to war?
Yeah. Well, at the point Lincoln's in Congress, it is a Whig position. He is in good company with the Whigs in terms of opposing the Mexican-American War. I think he legitimately believed that the president had provoked the Mexicans unnecessarily, that he had sent Taylor's detachment into disputed territory, that this was not necessarily the United States, maybe not even necessarily Mexico, but that he'd sent the military there to provoke the sort of response that happened with Mexican soldiers firing on Americans. Blood has been shed on American soil, and giving the casus belli for war. So I think Lincoln, just as a lawyer, looked at the evidence, the history of the area, whether the people in the area elected members to the legislature or the Constitutional Convention, did they serve on juries, who did they pay taxes to, who did they consider themselves a part of. And so he really focused on that spot where the war began, and basically blamed Polk for trying to begin a war unnecessarily. Mm-hmm. So I think that was sort of this logical, lawyerly thinking and getting to that point.
Thinking about logic and lawyerly things.
Got him in trouble.
Got him in trouble.
I think
but it's 10%. I'm sorry.
No, the Whigs had to be very careful about this because they weren't. It wasn't so much against the war, but it was focusing on the start of the war and trying to pin down Polk on having illegitimately started the war. But then they have to support the troops in the field, and so they can't appear to be like disloyal to that extent. So they're really trying to focus in on Polk and the start of the war, rather than necessarily the conduct of the war and the support of the troops. But of course, making that kind of distinction, particularly in the public, is not that too fine of a distinction.
Yes.
People aren't going to get it.
Yes, and the other area where they focused their fire was on concluding the war. So when you have a war that's sort of begun for a number of reasons, and there were a lot of reasons, it's much more than the attack on Taylor's detachment.
Slavery, Manifest Destiny, Oregon, California.
There were Americans who had legitimate claims against the Mexican government that weren't being honored. So there were a long list of things, long list of reasons why we went to war. So with that said, it's hard to say what's your exit strategy. I want everyone to use their imagination. Try to imagine this country in a war with no exit strategy, no clear objectives. And what would happen was, Polk had dispatched a diplomat to Mexico to go try to resolve the war. Says, we'll take California and what was then called New Mexico, which is basically everything we ended up taking from Mexico as a result of the war. He says, go ahead, get this for us, go conclude a peace. Well, he's down there for a while, and Polk reconsiders and tries to recall him. This is one of the great unheralded stories, I think, of American history. And this diplomat, Nicholas Trist, is going to, okay, he's like, I'm being recalled. And he waits for his detachment to come get him, to escort him to Veracruz. None ever shows up. Well, then you have other people down there saying, you know what? Make the peace anyway. And so we have a renegade diplomat down there who says, you know what, we're going to go ahead and I got the terms that Polk sent me down here to get. I don't care if he's changed his mind. This treaty's getting sent back to D.C.
And
for a long
has
time.
to deal with now what do I do with it now?
Polk almost repudiates it.
He almost did, yes.
He almost repudiates it. But
that's careful what you wish for.
Yeah, so the Whigs are trying to resolve this war. And, Polk is and there's also something called the All Mexico movement, which was a very powerful movement. The president did not specifically oppose this movement, may have embraced it privately, that we're going to take all of Mexico. Why not? Let's just take the whole country. Because major fighting had been over for quite a long time by the time Lincoln gets to Congress. We're in control of Mexico City. There's almost no government for them to deal with for a long time. So the position of some was, let's just take it. And the Whigs were like, whoa, we get California, we get New Mexico. Let's take it and let's make peace.